how can anybody refuse you legal rights to your own property?
Miles Best here, journalist, host of Above the Noise, and plant father. You know, way before Earth Day was a thing, indigenous people were the OG caretakers of the land, and then a bunch of colonizers stole the whole dang place. That's right, many indigenous tribes were forcibly removed from their ancestral homelands to make room for incoming settlers. And then millions of acres of that land became national parks to preserve some of America's most treasured natural beauty for generations to come. Now, the US federal government is responsible for protecting and maintaining those areas, but the indigenous-led movement Land Back is demanding for a change in ownership of all stolen lands, including national parks, to indigenous communities to manage. So today we're asking, what would it look like if Native Americans reclaimed their land? Okay, that's a pretty big question. So it's a good thing I've got Shy here on set to help me answer it. Take it away.
Thanks, Miles. Hey friends, Shy Barefoot here, member of the Chiricahua Apache Nation and lover of all things nature. Except for bugs. I really don't like bugs. Anyway, before I really dive into the episode, it's important for you to know that indigenous land is everywhere. It isn't only limited to wide open spaces of natural landscape. I'm on indigenous land right now. This episode is being filmed on land occupied by the confederated villages of the Lishan, the Ohlone people, and the Muwekma people. And today, we're exploring the significance of land from an indigenous perspective. All right, let's get into it. So, indigenous people reclaiming land isn't a novel idea, and the land back movement has been around for a very long time, but it's really gained a lot of traction in recent years. You're probably wondering, why do indigenous people need a movement like Land Back in the first place? And why are national parks part of the discussion? Spoiler alert, it's not pretty, and it involves a lot of old white guys. So back in the late part of the 19th century, when the government started creating national parks, they couldn't see native peoples and nature coexisting. John Muir, who people often considered the father of the national park system, was flat out racist.
As human beings, we're not supposed to be away from land the way that we are in urban settings. That's where human beings need to be. We need to be re-engaged with the land. To have human hands interacting with land again is really what needs to happen.
That's Karina Gold, co-director for the Segorite Land Trust, a woman-led organization in the Bay Area that works to return indigenous land to indigenous people. But, you know, this whole idea of human beings belong in nature really didn't mesh well with the settlers, so they removed indigenous people anyway. And they did this using every technique under the sun. Starving tribes by destroying their food sources, tricking tribal leaders into signing treaties, and murdering entire indigenous communities, which, by the way, was legal and people were often paid to do this.
Wait, for real?
Yeah, seriously, like between the 1600s through the 1900s, the US government paid people the equivalent of $12,000 in today's currency per the scalp of each indigenous man and half of that for each indigenous woman.
Dang.
As a matter of fact, in New England alone, government payments for 375 human scalps were uncovered, which equals millions of dollars in today's currency. And because most American schools primarily teach the positives of the national parks, a lot of people don't really know this side of the history. Let me help you understand the scope of what we're dealing with here. Most, if not all, of the 84 million acres that span between the 423 national park sites were home to indigenous peoples. When Yellowstone became the first national park in 1872, it was intended as a public park or pleasuring ground for the benefit and enjoyment of the people. Of course, I'ma guess the government's definition of people didn't include all of the indigenous people they forced off the land. This idea of the land exists to serve people is so different from the other indigenous perspectives that I've heard. You see, it wasn't just indigenous peoples colonizers tried to get rid of when they came. They also tried to get rid of collective cultural knowledge. Bear with me as I try to explain this next part as best I can. There are two big differences between the indigenous and colonizer relationship with nature. Historically, the general vibe of colonizer culture as modeled in the Bible is that nature is something to control and dominate. Take this verse from Genesis. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over every living thing that moves upon the earth. Indigenous peoples, however, accept that there exists a cosmological relationship of all living things existing together.
That we remember our place in this circle of life. That we remember that we're the younger brothers or sisters, the human beings, and we are the only ones that took ourselves out of that circle. And when we took ourselves out of that circle, the world became unbalanced. And as human beings, we need to come back into that circle and to see everything that was created as equal to us, and that we are not above it.
This means all land, including sacred sites and all living things, are worthy of protection, not only the areas white people designated as national parks. Before colonizers came, Indigenous peoples managed the land for millennia. They used the knowledge that had been passed down from generation to generation to both feed themselves and protect the land. For example, some tribes of Yosemite Valley managed land using fire. They burned underbrush and created pasture lands to provide nutrient-rich forage for deer and to help support the growth of woodland food crops. So the idea that national parks were untouched for thousands of years is a complete myth. Indigenous people have been advocating for the return of stolen lands since the very beginning, and the global land back movement is fighting to make this a reality. After the height of the No Dakota Access Pipeline protests at Standing Rock, the movement has continued to gain momentum and support from people outside of the Indigenous community. And in response to protests at Mount Rushmore in 2020, the Indigenous organization Indian Collective created the Land Back Manifesto, the reclamation of everything stolen from the original peoples, and officially launched a formal campaign on Indigenous Peoples Day of that year.
So this land back movement in the Bay Area is about creating a place for Indigenous people to be able to feel safe, a place for us to pray and bring back language, a re-engagement with the land and the waterways as our ancestors have always told us we are supposed to be, encouraging us to make relationships with our relatives, the plants and the foodways, sharing those out to community members, whether they're Indigenous or not.
And of course, for us, land isn't an isolated thing you can own. It's all connected to all of these larger issues Land Back seeks to heal and reclaim. Languages and ceremonies, governmental sovereignty, food and housing security, equitable access to healthcare and education, all part of a larger goal to dismantle white supremacy and uplift BIPOC groups. To some, the idea of returning land back to Indigenous communities, especially the national parks, is absurd.
You look at the broader land back movement and, you hear academics and activists and protectors and give it all back. And then you see people in the general public freaking out about what does that mean, right? What does that mean, give it all back? It really does mean give it all back because it was stolen land.
People have told me it's impossible, there's so much land, and how will the government divide it up among the different tribes? Or why transfer park management away from the government if they're doing a good job? Well, there's so much more at stake than just paying for maintenance or facilities costs. The moral argument is that this is stolen land and these resources should go back to tribes to manage. The success stories popping up here in the US are giving us a glimpse into a possible future where stolen land is managed by Indigenous peoples once again. Here's just one example. The Esalen tribe purchased 1,200 acres in Big Sur, California after 250 years to be used for educational, cultural, and conservation purposes. And recently, Governor Gavin Newsom proposed to give $100 million to tribes to purchase back ancestral lands. This is seen as a big win. But if you really think about it, it's kind of messed up because they had to purchase the land back that was stolen from them, and that's like buying back your stolen bike from the flea market. But these stories aren't only limited to the United States. Land back is happening globally. And get this, the Indigenous way of managing land also helps to combat climate change. For example, research shows that lands managed by Indigenous communities in Brazil, Australia, and Canada are equally and sometimes even more biodiverse than special conservation lands managed by the governments. In the end, this isn't just about repairing the harm done to Indigenous people. It's so much bigger than that. It's also about healing the land itself, especially land that's been trashed. And current scientific evidence advocates for Indigenous land stewardship practices to reduce the impact of climate change. There's so much more information available on this topic, so I highly suggest checking out the links in the description to learn more. Like this video if you're currently living on Earth, and subscribe to our channel if you want to see more content like this. Thanks for watching.
Thanks, Shy. That was dope. But before y'all go, big news for history buffs. PBS Digital Studios has a new history-themed channel called PBS Origins, and we think you're gonna love it. The channel will be home to multiple shows, including a new series called Historian's Take. This show explores history through the lens of pop culture, examining what that culture can tell us about its time period and what it means for our future. PBS Origins will have even more new stuff on the way, so hit the link in the description and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss anything. All right, peace out.